It's really striking when you think about it. 80 years after World War II fundamentally changed the Pacific, that same vast region is right back at the center of global strategy.
It really is.
You probably remember the stories, maybe you saw pictures of American power projected from places like Tinian back then.
Yeah.
Massive scale, right?
Absolutely. A different era.
Well, let's unpack that, because what's happening there now, it echoes history, sure, but the playbook, it's radically different. Vulnerability adaptation. That's the name of the game now.
Exactly.
So today we're doing a deep dive into America's military strategy, specifically its readiness in the Pacific, especially, with the potential for confrontation with China looming. Our mission for you listening in is to really get a handle on the immense challenges, but also the pretty innovative, sometimes frankly radical solutions being cooked up for this new era.
And guiding us here, we're drawing heavily on insights from a recent international section of The Economist. It's dated August 16th, 2025. And it pulls together strategic analyses, military perspectives, paints a, pretty detailed and honestly quite sobering picture of how that Pacific chessboard has been completely reset.
Okay, so sobering is the word. As we dig into this, what does it all really mean for how nations gear up for conflict now in the 21st century?
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, how does this massive rethink impact global stability? I mean, are we even grasping the full implications yet? Let's explore that.
Let's do it.
So when we talk about the U.S. and the Pacific, you can't escape the history.
Right.
Tinian, for instance.
Right.
World War II, it was for a time the largest air base anywhere on Earth. Just a massive hub for U.S. strategy. Thousands of flights launched from there.
Incredible. So, yeah.
Now it's a national monument, kind of a reminder of that industrial-scale war. But what's fascinating is how history is, I guess, looping back. America's current setup still leans hard on just a handful of spots. The sources call them the 4 runways. Tinian, Saipan, Guam, and Wake Island. It's almost like a legacy system, really, from that earlier time. Yeah. Exactly. A legacy system facing a very modern threat.
And that's where the stark contrast really hits you. While the U.S. has these few critical fixed points, China is described as, not just reviving its own old wartime sites, but crucially building this truly enormous modern arsenal of precision missiles.
Right. Missiles aimed right at those legacy bases.
Precisely. And the Economist insight here is critical. These missiles are designed and apparently quite capable of hitting those exact U.S. bases.
And the language they use, it's strong.
It is. They don't just talk about war. They call it a potential cataclysm. That word choice alone tells you something.
Yeah, it suggests devastation beyond typical conflict scenarios.
Yeah.
Makes you think about the cost of failure differently.
Totally. Not just about winning or losing ground, but about the whole structure of global stability maybe coming apart. We haven't really faced that kind of language since the Cold War peak.
Okay, so that raises the immediate massive question. How do you even start rethinking your strategy when your core bases, the foundation of your operations, are suddenly, sitting ducks? This brings us to what sounds like a fundamental, almost unthinkable shift, doesn't it? The end of the big fixed base era.
It really does seem that way. China's huge investment in these long-range accurate missiles has basically created what analysts are calling a kill zone.
A kill zone?
Yeah. It just makes concentrating forces in those traditional large bases incredibly risky, maybe even impossible.
So how bad is it? The Economist has these calculators you mentioned. What do the numbers actually say?
The numbers are stark, honestly. Our sources suggest China has somewhere between, say, 300 and 600 medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs and IRBMs.
Okay.
And these can definitely hit Guam, which is, a central U.S. hub out there.
Wow, 300 to 600.
And get this, a conservative estimate suggests they could potentially launch maybe 400 bombs or missiles per day at targets within that 500 to 1,500-mile range.
400. A day.
Yeah.
How do you possibly operate under that kind of sustained attack?
Exactly. Imagine a major forward base like Kadena in Okinawa. It might, withstand 400 hits for maybe a day, 2 days, before it's essentially crippled.
Crippled or just gone?
Pretty much. And even the bases further out in what's called the second island chain.
That's like Japan down through Guam, Palau, Tinian, right? That arc.
That's the one. It offers more distance, which used to mean more safety. But even those bases might only hold out for, say, 60 days under a really sustained assault.
So even distance isn't the protection it once was.
Not in the Missile Age, no. The maps in the article are pretty clear. They show the PLA's hypothetical strike range extending out maybe 2,000 nautical miles from China's coast.
And Guam.
Guam is squarely inside that range, no question.
Okay, so that really forces America's hand. This is where the hide-and-seek strategy comes in.
Absolutely. It's a dramatic, almost existential shift. You can't stay put, so you disperse. You spread forces out across a huge, unpredictable area. You move away completely from that Cold War model of big, centralized, easy-to-hit bases.
And new planes to match. These B-22 jets sound intriguing, like a transport and a bomber had a baby.
Yeah, the description is fascinating, isn't it? A blend of a C-130 transports utility with a B-2 bomber's stealth.
So sneaky but can carry stuff.
That seems to be the idea. A multi-role plane that can slip under the radar but also deliver personnel or critical supplies to these small, scattered, maybe temporary locations. It's like the physical embodiment of hide and seek.
Right, it's a whole new mindset, not just new tech. But,
Right.
okay, scattering everything like that, that must create its own set of massive problems. Logistics.
Oh, absolutely. A logistical nightmare, potentially. The U.S. military machine is built on these robust, predictable supply lines going to a few big established bases.
Like superhighways for supply.
Exactly. Now, suddenly, the need is to service maybe over 100 small, often temporary spots spread across this enormous ocean theater.
100. Wow.
And as one expert in the sources, and Mr. Walton points out, those old supply lines are obsolete in this kind of scenario.
Because it's not just bullets and beans, is it?
Not at all. It's everything. Highly specialized jet fuel, critical spare parts that might be needed right now, medical supplies, even just basic stuff for thousands of troops operating in really remote, maybe quite basic conditions.
Trying to manage that supply chain? I mean, even in peacetime, it sounds incredibly complex, under threat of attack.
It's unprecedented. It completely changes what military resupply even means.
So given that scale, how do they even attempt to manage it? The sources talk about this shell game strategy. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Yeah, the shell game. It's all about survival through, well, deception, hiding, and constant movement. If the enemy can hit fixed targets, you just can't afford to be fixed.
Makes sense. So practical examples.
Well, they mentioned things like pop-up shelters. These sound pretty clever camouflaged inflatable structures. Basically, giant high-tech tents you can put up and take down fast.
So you can hide planes quickly, move them around.
Exactly. Disperse aircraft across multiple spots, hide them from satellites or spy planes, buy yourself critical time if a missile attack is coming. It's about agility.
And we've seen those pictures, right? The elephant walk on Tinian. All those fighters and cargo planes lined up.
Right. That's not just for show. It's practicing that rapid launch capability, showing they can get airborne quickly from these dispersed, maybe temporary fields. It's readiness demonstrated.
And this reforpack exercise they mention. C-130s from Alaska practicing operating from 50 different locations. That sounds like putting the shell game theory into practice on a huge scale.
It absolutely is. It highlights that this isn't just tweaking things. It's a fundamental overhaul of how they train and plan to operate.
It really drives home the complexity.
It does. And the Air Force Chief of Staff, David Alvin, he sums it up well. His quote is, "Agility for effect and disaggregation for survival."
Disaggregation. Breaking things up.
That's the key, breaking up into smaller, harder-to-target pieces. Every unit, every plane has to be able to operate more independently, move constantly, and be supplied without relying on one big, vulnerable hub. It's a whole new combat ecosystem they're trying to build.
You know, what really strikes me here is how interconnected everything is. General Schneider, head of Pacific Air Forces, points to the tyranny of distance in the Pacific.
Yeah, it's vast out there.
And couples that with the sheer complexity of logistics, plus the vulnerability of data networks. Those are the critical challenges he sees.
Makes sense.
And it feels like, I don't know, a massively magnified version of the supply chain problems we've all seen recently, right? Microchips, building supplies, whatever.
It's a fair comparison, yeah.
Imagine that kind of fragility, but the stakes are national security. And the products are like precision weapons and life support.
Yeah.
It really makes you question how robust our global systems are for any big disruption, military or otherwise. The ripples go way beyond the battlefield.
That's a really important point. The dependencies are complex.
So if the logistics are this huge mountain to climb, how is technology helping? The sources mention some really cool stuff, like 3D printing spare parts right on the spot.
Yeah, that's a potential game changer. Think about it. A fighter jet needs some specific, maybe obscure part on a tiny remote island.
Normally, that's weeks of waiting for shipping, right?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
But with 3D printing, you could potentially fabricate it right there, on site, maybe in hours. It drastically cuts delays, and it also means you don't need huge, vulnerable stockpiles of every possible part everywhere.
Less stuff to ship, less stuff to protect.
Precisely. And then there's AI. Using artificial intelligence to manage these incredibly complex, constantly shifting supply chains across these huge distances.
What does that actually mean, using AI for logistics?
Well, imagine an AI system analyzing countless factors in real time. Weather, enemy movements, fuel consumption rates, which transport planes or ships are available.
Okay.
And it uses all that data to optimize routes, predict what's needed where before it's critical, and reroute supplies dynamically as locations shift or threats emerge. It's the kind of problem complexity that, frankly, only AI might be able to handle effectively.
Wow. It's like the ultimate delivery network optimization, but under fire.
Something like that, yeah, with much higher stakes.
And then there's this other big tech shift mentioned by David Ochmanek at Rand, this idea of thousands of small, cheap drones launched from trucks, even rockets.
Yeah, this is a really significant shift in thinking. It moves away from relying solely on expensive, complex, and ultimately vulnerable platforms like manned fighter jets.
Because losing one of those is a huge deal.
A massive blow, financially and operationally. But if you lose one of thousands of cheap drones, it's a setback, sure, but not a catastrophic one.
So it's about numbers and distribution.
Exactly. You can use these drones in swarms to overwhelm defenses, do reconnaissance, maybe even carry out strikes, all without risking pilots in the same way. It spreads the risk and builds resilience through sheer quantity and distribution.
And they're not just acting alone, right? This Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, the CCA program. These drones are meant to be controlled by manned aircraft, like robot wingmen.
That's the concept. A single pilot in a fighter jet could potentially control several CCAs.
Doing what?
All sorts of things. Extending the pilot's sensor range, acting as decoys to draw enemy fire, maybe carrying extra weapons or electronic warfare pods.
So it multiplies the effectiveness of each manned plane.
Absolutely. It lets the manned aircraft operate more safely, further back maybe, while the drones push forward into the higher threat areas. It makes the force more flexible, more adaptable. You're leveraging human decision-making with the expendability and endurance of unmanned systems.
Okay, this all sounds incredibly ambitious. Seems vital, frankly, given the threat picture you painted. But the money.
Ah, yes, the budget.
The sources point out this disconnect. The Air Force budget apparently shows a huge puff, lots of talk, big plans for these new ideas, but the actual funding, the actual budget is flat.
Yeah.
How does that even work? Isn't that setting these crucial innovations up to fail or at least be drastically under-resourced?
It's a major paradox, and honestly, one of the most concerning points raised in the Economist piece. There's clear recognition of the urgent need to transform, to invest in these new ways of operating.
But the checkbook isn't matching the shopping list.
Pretty much. The flat budget could be due to lots of things: competing demands from other services, political issues, the sheer cost of other defense programs. But the result is the same. Without sustained increased funding, even the smartest strategies might just stay on paper.
So tough choices ahead. What gets cut, what gets delayed.
Exactly. And that directly impacts how fast and how effectively they can actually make this pivot in the Pacific happen.
Which brings up that final point about pace. Remember Tinian, that massive base built in just 6 months back in 1944. Wartime urgency, right?
Incredible feat of engineering and will.
Contrast that with today. The sources say similar efforts building up infrastructure now are taking much, much longer. Lieutenant General Daniel Leaf calls it a peacetime mindset. Bureaucracy, maybe? Inertia?
Could be a combination of factors: regulations, environmental reviews, lack of that same existential urgency perhaps, but the effect is a slower pace.
But how do you square that? How do you effectively prepare for a threat that's evolving so rapidly, a threat described as potentially cataclysmic, when your own internal pace feels, well, peacetime?
Yeah.
Feels like a fundamental mismatch.
It's a huge challenge for planners, for policymakers, for the entire system, matching the internal clock speed to the external threat environment.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've taken this deep dive into how America's grappling with this completely changed reality in the Pacific, moving away from those big, vulnerable legacy bases towards this dispersed, agile, tech-heavy shell game.
Yeah, a necessary shift driven by that stark missile threat.
The ambition is definitely there. But wow, the hurdles are monumental. Logistics, tech integration, and maybe the biggest one, funding, and just sheer organizational speed.
It's incredibly complex, and it's evolving fast. Constant adaptation seems to be the only way forward. The stability of the whole region really hangs on getting this right.
It really does. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. As we've explored just how massive this strategic shift is, what does readiness even mean anymore?
Good question.
Is it just about having the fanciest weapons? Or is it something more? More about mental agility, the speed of adaptation, the willingness to just fundamentally rip up the old playbook and rethink how you operate on this global stage?
It's probably much more the latter these days.
Yeah. It definitely leaves you with something profound to mull over, doesn't it? History and the future colliding right there across the Pacific.